She is the author, is affecting the sex rights of women and girls. In 2023, Feminist Legal Clinic was granted Special Consultative Status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Welcome aboard, everyone. And now I'd like to hand over to Anna Kerr.
Thanks, Janet, and I'll just share my screen. Is that working okay, Janet? Oops.
Yep, that's great.
Okay, thanks. So this is the same talk I gave at the same session as Susan last Saturday. So I think most of you know Feminist Legal Clinic is an unfunded community legal service based in Sydney, which is operated entirely by volunteer effort. We were established in 2017, and much of our work started off really with a lot of domestic violence advocacy work, for which we did have some legal aid funding at that stage, as well as cases in discrimination law. And the City of Sydney Council was originally very supportive, provided us with a free office and also money for a launch. And all was going well for several years until this event that we held in 2020, where we launched Women's Declaration International in Australia as the Australian country contact. And you can see some of the speakers here. And that event was at Sydney University, hosted by Bronwyn Winter. But anyhow, I don't know, some of you might even recall the event. And of course, we had some protesters. And here's a picture of the protesters storming the auditorium. And they snatched the microphone from our speakers. And you can see they've got a sign there saying homophobes fuck off, which kind of ironic considering that they've just taken the microphone from some lesbian women who were speaking, and continued to rant and rave until the police were called, and then they took off and stole some of our brochures on the way out. And now, following that incident, we were contacted by the City of Sydney Council staff who were concerned. They'd received a complaint. We later found, of course, that the complaint was from the gender clinic, from Eloise Brooke. Some of you might be familiar with his work. Anyhow, they were concerned that some of our activity, they were concerned about our activity for women's sex-based rights movement, that we were told that we'd have to stop doing that. And they were also concerned about the material that we post on a regular basis on our news blog, our news digest, which is just news reports generally, but which they felt had the potential to offend members of the trans community. And this, I hope you can see, I don't know whether you can see the full cartoon. This is a cartoon by Stella Perrott, and that was among the material that was cited as grounds for terminating our tenancy, which eventually there was a process, and many women wrote opposing it and supporting our clinic. In fact, hundreds of women wrote, and there were petitions with hundreds of signatures, and none of that made any difference. One short email from Eloise Brooks from the Gender Centre was far more effective than hundreds of women writing individual letters. That none of that made any difference to the City of Sydney, and we were evicted. Well, our tenancy was terminated. So despite all this, we've continued with our work in exile, as Janet likes to say. We're in exile, but we continue to work from home and support women who are also battling this. And of course, the heading of this talk was that lesbians are fighting back in Australia or Australasia, and indeed they are. And I'm sure those listening are familiar with the current case taking place, Lesbian Action Group versus the Australian Human Rights Commission. And there's currently a federal court appeal in progress in respect to this matter. So the Lesbian Action Group had, of course, originally requested an exemption from the Sex Discrimination Act so that they could exclude men and heterosexual women from their events. However, it was determined that while it would be acceptable for them to exclude heterosexual women and males generally, no exemption could be granted for them to exclude those males who identify as trans women, as it was considered that that would offend the gender identity provisions of the Sex Discrimination Act. So we took the original decision on appeal to the Administrative Review Tribunal, and they unfortunately upheld the decision. I saw someone in the chat talking about that decision and looking for a copy of it. I put a link in the chat where you can access it, as well as a whole lot of other documents that were tendered in that case. A lot of them are available through our website. And as I say, now the case is on appeal to the Federal Court. And the women are represented by Lee Howard of the Bar. Feminist Legal Clinic isn't involved any further, but the matter is progressing through the Federal Court. And I'm sure some of you probably know more about it because I think it's just been mentioned again in the Federal Court, maybe on Friday. But I won't be discussing that in any detail, obviously, because it is a case before the court. But it's not the only case, or the only effort that has been made by lesbian women to push back against this. Some of you would be familiar with the previous cases of Jessica Hoyle, who she brought a case against the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner on similar grounds. She again wanted to have a lesbian event in Launceston where she wanted to just exclude all males, including those who claimed to be women. But she was unsuccessful. The Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner refused her that exemption. We took it on appeal to the Tasmanian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, and sadly we were unsuccessful at that level as well. And although Jessica herself was desperate to take the matter to the High Court, or to the court system generally, everyone always goes straight to the High Court in their minds, but it's a very, very slow and onerous process, and also one that is fraught with risk for anyone who brings these cases through the court system, because there's always the risk of a cost order against you personally if you bring this kind of litigation. Not so much at the tribunal level, but once you reach the court system, the risks are greater. And there's also, significant filing fees and disbursements, even if your lawyers are acting pro bono, as we were. So there's a lot of reasons why a lot of these cases are not pursued, and that doesn't mean that they don't have merit. It's just, this is the reality of our legal system. So many women are keen to bring these cases, but they don't necessarily get legal advice beforehand. And so they may, for instance, commence proceedings in their own name without having incorporated an association, which is always a good idea, because if you are thinking you might take litigation further, it's a good idea to have an incorporated body with limited liability rather than exposing yourself to risk. I mean, unless you're in the position of actually having absolutely no assets or no income, in which case you're the ideal litigant. But if you have something to lose, kind of unwise to start the process without having had a bit of advice about that. So it is, if you want to fight back, it's important to be prepared and equipped to last the distance. And that means not only having some funding for disbursements and like filing fees, which can be actually really quite substantial, but also obviously having an appropriate legal team with the necessary expertise, advice about incorporation where appropriate, and advice about the general legal prospects of the case, because running ill-advised cases is not ideal for achieving law reform. However, admittedly, the accompanying publicity that we've had for some of these cases is useful in terms of raising public awareness of the issue, which I think in itself is important. But it's worth keeping in mind that those promoting gender ideology are very strategic with the cases they bring in terms of choosing which litigants, they will use to progress a particular cause. And that's probably a reflection of their greater access to legal advice and to also campaign strategists, because they seem to think these things through very carefully. And that's why we now have a case history going back 30 years of cases which have acknowledged that sex can be changed, and all these things which now we now are trying to push back against. It's very difficult because of the amount of case law that's been established. of course, some cases are not planned by women but are thrust upon them. So, for example, Jessica Hoyle was shopping in a department store wearing her LGB Tasmania hat and shirt and having a pleasant enough conversation with a fellow shopper who recognised her and shared her concerns. And a member of staff overheard the conversation and asked Jessica to leave the store, basically for being a TERF. So this is clearly, I would say, a case of discrimination in the provision of goods and services. And in Tasmania, there's protections for political opinion and activity. And so we brought a claim to the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, and then after that to the tribunal, but both determined that being a TERF does not constitute a political opinion or activity. So unfortunately, again, the matter wasn't taken further, and which is a great pity because I think the decision was wrong. But this is the difficulty that you face, that if you can't, you're not in a position to go further through the court system, that then sits there and is then referred to by other decision makers. Not ideal. So this quote, I do not agree with what you I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. It's typically attributed to Voltaire, but it was in fact his female biographer, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, who summarised his position with these words. She, by the way, had to use a male pseudonym. She found it necessary to use a male pseudonym to write. Anyhow, I digress, but this principle of defending people's right to say something that you don't agree with, well, that seems to have been completely lost on our human rights commissions. It just really demonstrates how flimsy discrimination protections are. So not only because they seem to be, at the moment, prioritising the rights of individuals who identify as trans over the rights of lesbians and over women's rights generally, but they absolutely failed to protect political opinions and activities and freedom of speech. Unless what you're saying has the approval of the commissioner, those protections apparently don't apply. That seems to be the impression I have, and I've seen that not only in relation to that case of Jessica Hoyle, but also in relation to the whistleblower protections, which are meant to protect people who want to blow the whistle on things that are happening if they're working, for instance, in a government department, and there are things happening which they think constitutes malfeasance or maladministration, or the wrong thing is being done. That people are meant to be able to, expose that without risking their own employment if they go through a particular procedure. But anyhow, my experience with trying to pursue that with a few of our clients who come to us saying, look, I want to expose what's happening here on the front of, the women's rights being compromised in various ways. The trouble is the Ombudsman, who oversees those whistleblower protections, they've also had the trading from ACON, and they don't regard those whistleblowers as attracting the protection of the whistleblower legislation. So there is a real shortcoming in that legislation. So certainly this fight is as much about freedom of speech and freedom of association as it is about women's sex-based rights. And freedom of speech and freedom of association are not the only casualties of gender identity ideology. There's also the lives of countless young women and girls that are being harmed by the fraudulent sex change industry. So in 2022, Jay Langadinas commenced proceedings in Sydney against her doctors for the harm she suffered as a result of masculinizing hormones and for undergoing a mastectomy and hysterectomy. She's, of course, not alone. Many other women are in similar distressing circumstances, but there are still very difficult barriers to commencing personal injury litigation. Finding firms willing to run this litigation is at the moment still difficult. Normally, personal injury firms will run these cases on a no-win, you don't have to pay any fees, no win, no fee basis. But because of the very contentious matter of nature of these cases. It's still early days, and there's a certain reluctance among firms to start bringing these cases. There's also difficulties in terms of time limits. Often there's quite a lot of psychological hurdles for these young women to overcome before they're ready to go and see a solicitor, and all of this causes delay, and so we then run into those difficulties with time limits. It's also finding expert witnesses, the doctors that you need to provide opinions to support these cases can be quite difficult in this current environment, where any medical practitioner who speaks out on this issue has their professional qualifications threatened. Frankly, they get complaints against them. So that's all very difficult. There's a picture of a couple of other women who are rare, really, in being willing to speak out about their experiences. Again, I'll say as detransitioners, although we all know that's not really an adequate word, since there's no such thing as transition. But I think we all know what we're talking about until someone comes up with a better word for it. So yeah, it's good to see a few women starting to speak out about their experiences. We hope with time that will embolden more to speak out. But at the moment, it is very frightening for people who've had these experiences, because it results in even more social isolation, as the community that they were within then will reject them very, very harshly. So that's a big hurdle for them. Look, the other thing to say is that lesbians, although it's been really obvious over the last decade, this has become a really big issue. Around the time we Feminist Legal Clinic set up, it started being a very large issue. But in fact, this battle has been going on for decades, as the lesbian women in particular know more than anyone, I think, because they have been fighting these battles for many decades. So some of the earlier battles that women have told me about included the battle over the lesbian project space in lesbian space project in Redfern. I think that was in the 1990s. And then there was, of course, the cancellation of LesFest in 2003, 2004. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And also Sappho's Party case, which was in 2006, 2009. And no doubt there's many others that I don't know if there's many others, but I've no doubt there's other cases that I'm not aware of. There were also many, many submissions being written by lesbian women over a long period. And we were interested to come across a very lengthy submission, 15,000 words, by Irinya's Autonomous Activist Lesbians. That was sent in 2010 to the Australian Human Rights Commission. It's an excellent submission, but clearly it fell on deaf ears. The silencing of lesbian voices and the erasure of this history of opposition is really significant, because it allows the gender identity movement to masquerade as if they are some sort of progressive human rights movement, and that the only opposition is from, bigoted conservatives. So it's very important that we keep talking about this history and how much lesbian women have been fighting back, and have received really very little credit for all that effort. Just to touch on those couple of cases, cancellation of LesFest. So this is a picture here of Sally Goldner, who was a founder of Transgender Victoria, and took the organisers of the Lesbian Festival, or LesFest, in 2004. She took them to the Victorian Equal Opportunity Commission for advertising that the forthcoming festival was for lesbians born female only. Now, since doing that, of course, unfortunately, the lesbian women managed originally to get an exemption, but it was then overturned. And so, faced with, again, the threat of litigation and all that involves, LesFest 2004 was officially cancelled. I think maybe a private party took place, but LesFest was cancelled and has been since then. So Sally Goldner was actually successful in undermining the rights of lesbian women to meet. And and has since received all sorts of accolades. I think some of them are listed there, including an Order of Australia in 2019. So this is all very hard to witness, very difficult. However, I'm pleased to say that women haven't given up. The fight continues because some of the original women who were involved in that are the ones who are now bringing the current Lesbian Action Group case in the federal court. And so I find impressive that women haven't given up, that we're still fighting. And I think there needs to be recognition of the fact that it's not all about winning. It's about keeping up the fight and not giving up the struggle. We have to just keep going, even though it's, of course, at the moment we're in a very dark place when it comes to women's rights. We have had some successes, and I should mention that the case of Sappho's party, the South Australian case of O'Keefe, was the complainant. There's a picture of him there. He is a psychotherapist, but the lesbian women did win that case, which is wonderful. However, having spoken to some of them, the process of the litigation took a terrible toll on them. So it's true that the legal process itself is a punishment, and it's always lengthier and more onerous than people expect. And I think that is no doubt at least partly intentional to deter the faint-hearted. But despite that, lesbian women are continuing to fight on, and hopefully will continue to do so despite all the many obstacles and difficulties. Thank you. That's my talk.
Thank you, Anna. I love that talk. It's so inspiring. Fantastic. Thank you so much.